Once again, our class is dedicated to the memory of Adam Yakubovich, a dear friend of ours and a regular at our JLI classes over the years, one of the founding members of our Chabad in Old Japan. This week's lesson, lesson 2, I'm going to go through a couple different parts of what this lesson is going to deal with. There are 4 sections in this lesson. The first section is about the moment of passing, the spiritual significance of when a person passes away, of that moment. We will also talk about the process of the soul's departure. Next, we will examine Jewish traditions that surround the care of the body of the deceased, as well as the burial. And we will also deal with grave visitation. Each of these parts carry with it the same theme, which is the relationship that we can have with the soul even after it parts. So that's something that we're going to see throughout. I want to give an introduction, a little introduction to the first reading that we're going to do tonight, which would be on page 43 by Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Introduction number 1. The founder of the Hasidic movement was the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. When Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov passed away, his successor was the Maggid of Mezrich. When the Maggid of Mezrich passed away, he had many students who became rabbis and leaders of many communities, and that's pretty much how the Hasidic groups began after the passing of the Maggid of Mezrich, which was in 1772. At that time, the main disciple to take over was a rabbi by the name of Reb Mendel Haradaka. He was also known as Reb Mendel Vitebsk, both from the places which he lived in, Haradak or Vitebsk. The name Menachem Mendel, which the Rebbe had, which he was named after his great-great-grandfather, was originally named after this Reb Mendel Haradak. So most Mendels, especially in the Chabad community, originate from this Reb Mendel Haradak. In 1777, Reb Mendel Haradak and his Hasidim, several hundred of his Hasidim, of his followers, decided to travel to Israel and to live in Israel. Again, this is in the year 1777. Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, who was a colleague of Reb Mendel Haradak, he also wanted to go up together to Israel, to move to Israel together with his colleague. However, after beginning his journey, he actually turned back because many of the Hasidim asked him to stay. They wanted to have someone to lead them in Russia-Poland border. So the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, becomes the Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement at that time. He establishes, we spoke about this at the end of class last week, the organization that my brother works for, Kol Al Chabad, which is the oldest charity for Israel, actually began in 1777 by the Alter Rebbe, the Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi's initiative, to be able to fund and send money to Israel, which got him in trouble, because at that time, Israel was under Turkish rulership, and Russia and Turkey were at war with each other. and that got the Alter Rebbe in trouble. So a year later, sadly, in 1778, just 1 year after traveling to Israel, Reb Mendel Haradak, this great rabbi who moves to Israel, he passed away. And this letter that we're going to read, which is part of the book of Tanya, this is an excerpt of the book of Tanya, which is a section that the Alter Rebbe wrote to the Hasidim, to the followers of Reb Mendel Haradak in Israel, to console them from their loss. So that's introduction number one. Introduction number two are terms that we're going to use in the letter. On Yom Kippur, some of you may remember, because I often mention it, that there are 5 prayers rather than the regular daily 3 prayers, and on Shabbat and holidays, including Rosh Chodesh, which is this tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh Adar, a joyous month, and on Rosh Chodesh we have 4 as a Shabbos. We have 4 prayers, so you have an extra prayer in addition to the morning, afternoon, and evening prayer. So on Shabbat and holidays we have 4 prayers. On Yom Kippur, there's an exception, and we have 5 prayers. Those 5 prayers are because each day of we have 5 levels of our soul. I'm going to try to make this very simple. There are 5 levels of the soul. On a regular day, we only tap in to 3 of the levels of the soul, which is the functional, emotional, and intellectual. Hopefully, we also tap into the intellectual part. We all tap into the functional part. We all tap into the emotional part. And hopefully, as we're doing tonight, we're also tapping into the intellectual part. But then there are 2 higher levels of the soul. One which we tap into on Shabbos with the holiness of Shabbos, which is why we smell the spices after Shabbos, because that extra level of the soul departs. And on Yom Kippur, we tap into all 5. Tonight, to make things very simple, we are only going to discuss 2 levels of the soul, the functional level of the soul and the emotional level of the soul. The first is the nefesh, the physical life, the functional. And the second is the ruach, which is the emotional level of the soul. So the 2 parts of the soul that we're going to discuss, we're actually going to focus mostly on the nefesh, but the 2 parts of the soul that we're going to discuss this evening are the nefesh, the physical, the functional part of the soul, and the ruach, the emotional part of the soul. When a person passes away, the nefesh, and we'll see there are different levels of nefesh, the physical life, the functional, remains in the grave with the body. The ruach, however, which is the emotional part of the soul, that ascends to Gan Eden, to the Garden of Eden. And that is the introduction that we have, and you could see that on page 42. There is just gives you a little diagram of what happens to the nefesh and the ruach. The nefesh enables the physical and biological life. It goes to the grave after. And the ruach, which enables the emotions, that goes to Gan Eden, to paradise. And now we can begin to read the text on page 43, text number 1a. As is known, the tzaddik, of the righteous person, is not physical, but spiritual. It consists of faith reverence, and love for God. During the tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these three attributes that belong to the soul dimension of ruach, which is the higher level, the emotional, are constrained with their container and within their container and garb, namely the nefesh that is bound to the corporeal body. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. As a result, all the tzaddik's disciples receive but a glow of these ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means of the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. The inability to receive directly from ruach is a relatory handicap, and therefore our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teachings. Okay, so let's stop for a moment before we continue. A tzaddik, his life, a righteous person, his life is focused on three things: faith, ahava, and yira, which is reverence and love. Ahava is love, yira is reverence for God. That's the three things that he's focused on. Every act that he does is based on these three things. Either it's an act of love, it's an act of reverence, or it's an act of faith. A tzaddik, the righteous person, influences others. Those are the disciples that we're talking about. Anybody who's influenced by a tzaddik becomes that tzaddik's disciple. However, being that the ruach, the emotional level of the tzaddik, is contained within the lower level, which is the functional level, the nefesh, therefore those who are influenced by the tzaddik have very limited influence. However, let's continue reading. By contrast, after the tzaddik's passing, the nefesh separates from the ruach and remains in the grave, while the ruach and its three attributes rise to Gan Eden, to paradise. Consequently, whoever is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden, because the ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to a physical space. There is now a straightforward path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's ruach, the faith, awe, and love with which the tzaddik served God, and not merely these attributes' outer glow that escaped beyond their container. The disciples connect and receive commensurate to the degree of their loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love. So the tzaddik's true power, which is his faith, which his motivation for everything he does, and his life, which is faith, reverence, and love, again, he influences others, but that influence is very limited until after he passes away. After he passes away, now there's no more nefesh, because that nefesh remains in the grave. The ruach, which is the emotions, is now unleashed, and now one is able to easily connect to the ruach, to this higher level of the tzaddik soul. To use a very simple analogy, when I want to teach a very small child, 3 or 4-year-old, I want to teach them a little math. So how do I teach them math? If you tell a 3-year-old 2 + 2 = 4, the child has no idea what you're talking about. So what do you have to do? In order for the child to understand as a concept of 2 plus 2, you take 4 apples, you take 2 apples and you say these 2 plus these 2 equals 4, right? Or as the joke goes, you know, they take away, right? The mother shows the child 5 apples, right? And the mother says, now I took away 2, how many do I have? And the child says, you have 2. Right? Every mother does this to their child, right? They take away, they put 5 and they take away 2 and they say, now how many do I have? And the child says 2. And the mother says, no, there's 3. Try this again. Okay. But eventually, the point is that eventually we want the child not to understand math in relationship to the apples. We want the child to understand the concept, the spiritual concept. We want the child to understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4. If a child grows up thinking that 2 apples plus 2 apples equals 4, you got a problem. In the same way, the physical life of the tzaddik, and as we will see, this relates to every human being, because as I explained last week, that we speak about a tzaddik living forever, and we speak about a tzaddik in the context of the soul, because the tzaddik is the righteous person, is the epitome of it. It helps us understand and appreciate the spiritual life. But we all have spiritual life. We all are motivated with kindness, with love. We do mitzvot, whether we light the Shabbat candles, whether we give charity, whatever mitzvah we do, in that respect, we are also a tzaddik. So this is not only for tzaddikim. What we're talking about is not only for the righteous person, but for every single human being. So ideally, you have in the person's life, you have those apples, which is the physical body, the nefesh, the lowest level of the soul, the functional part of the soul, which even now, as I'm speaking and explaining a concept, what's happening is you're relating to me to a deeper concept, to my intellect, but through my speech, through my function, which is very limited because I'm a limited human being. When a person passes away, and that physical element, that nefesh, and that ruach separate, the nefesh, which is the body, the functional part, and the ruach separate, now the ruach, which is the true spirit of that person, that's actually the Hebrew word ruach, we're talking about the emotional part of that person, but ruach actually means spirit. So the spirit of the person, which is the true person as we explained last week, that ruach is no longer limited to the physical body, to that nefesh level. And therefore, a person is able to connect to that tzaddik, to that person, on a much deeper level than one was able to prior while the person was still living in this world in a physical body. Text number 1b on page 45. Which will show us how this express this idea that the soul is able to express itself even more, and the connection that we have with that soul is now even more. This is from the Rebbe, a letter from the 5th of Tammuz, 1983. Number one, the death only affects the body. It is also a matter of common sense that whatever the direct cause of the separation of the soul from the body, whether a fatal accident or a fatal illness, etc., it could affect only any of the vital organs of the physical body, but could in no way affect the spiritual soul. And he goes on to explain the concept of how death frees the soul. A further point, which is also understandable, is that during the soul's lifetime on earth, in partnership with the body, the soul is necessarily handicapped in certain respects by the requirements of the body, such as eating and drinking, etc. Even a tzaddik whose entire life is consecrated to Hashem, to God, cannot escape the restraints of life in a material and physical environment. Consequently, when the time comes for the soul to return home from the place it came from, as we explained last week, it is essentially a release for it, as it makes it ascend to a higher world, no longer restrained by a physical body and physical environment. Henceforth, the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss of being near to Hashem in the fullest measure. Here is a beautiful video that we will watch at this time to give us a little bit more of appreciation of the difference between the soul and the way the soul sees things and experience, the soul's experience in the physical body while it's here, to the way the soul experiences things and sees things after 120, after its passing. Ayla, being that I can see you, can you just give me a thumbs up if you could hear the music? Thank you.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
Anyone counted?
The answer is 13.
Did anybody get it right?
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
That's what psychologists call inattentional blindness. And no, it is not a condition to be concerned about. In fact, life would be impossible without it. Let me explain. As powerful as the human brain may be, it is easily overwhelmed by the sheer onslaught of observation, calculation, sight, sound, and signals that envelop our every waking hour. The brain cannot permit itself to register and record each image and movement, every message and stimulation. Instead, our brains and nervous systems aggressively filter and limit our intake to manageable levels. The result? We notice a fraction and ignore the fullness, and remember far less. Often, we purposely engage in what cognitive neuroscientists call selective attention, like focusing on a dinner partner in a crowded restaurant, while tuning out all other conversations in the room. Now imagine that you had the ability to absorb everything around you, to absorb, comprehend, and recall all the details, and fetch every memory at will, without being overwhelmed. That is the incredible experience of the human soul, once it detaches from the body at the close of a lifetime. Unshackled from the frailties of a nervous system, unrestricted by networks of neurons, it is unbelievably free and powerfully present. It is free to absorb truths that mortal minds cannot contain, present to delight in the divine radiance that courses through the cosmos, to bask in divine understanding that supersedes human senses, but is savored by the newly liberated soul.
In other words, when the soul is in the body, the soul is limited by the body through the person's lifetime. However, after death, then we're able, the soul is now no longer limited, and it reaches a higher sense of itself, which is itself. And this idea is something that relates, as I said, to every single individual, not just the tzaddik, where the after a person's passing, the ruach, which is the ideas, their feelings, and so on, do not vanish. In fact, they intensify afterwards, which is why, one of the reasons why a person, after a person passes away, there is a lot of times a greater appreciation now for that individual. One of the reasons, simply why a person has a greater appreciation or a longing for a loved one is simply because there's an absence. An absence causes a longing. So that's on a very simple level. Also, on a simple level, after a person passes away, so now we sort of forget any of the things, the hiccups, or those things that might have annoyed us, and we only, as we long for them, we focus more on their positive side, and we have more of a yearning and a longing for this individual. But on a deeper level, the reason why we have this longing, this yearning for a soul, is because the positive qualities, this level of ruach that the soul has, intensifies after the person passes away. So the moment of passing is actually a very powerful moment. And we are able to connect to that ruach, to that emotional level of the soul that is now departed, and we relate to it and connect to it through spirituality. Now, to appreciate this better, we just have to think of the different stages and the way we relate to children, adults, different stages of a child's life. Then we could appreciate that after a person's passing, we could still relate to them, but the way we relate to them is very different. I often tell people that in talking about this after a passing, usually at the unveiling, that we can now continue that relationship that we had with our loved one, but now it's very different. Until now, if you wanted to remember, you want to sit down with them and you want to remember their life, you sat down with a photo album, you may have played sports with them, but now it's on a spiritual level. Now it's through mitzvot, through good deeds, through remembering them, through studying and so on, through spiritual endeavors. And this could be appreciated again by looking at the different stages of life. When you're talking about having a relationship with a toddler, so you'll shake a rattle. When you want to have a relationship with a 5-year-old, you read his favorite book. And then as the child gets older, you'll play a game. So now, after 120 years old, when a person's soul leaves its body, so now we can have a relationship and we can intensify our love, but the relationship is just on a spiritual level, it's slightly different. At this point of our class, we are going to have a meditation, as we did last week, to be able to meditate on the ideas that we've spoken about. But first, Caleb, I read your message just now. That's pretty cool. Can I share it? It's pretty. Caleb said he just watched that video, the basketball video, the other night. That's pretty amazing. So you were ready for class, ready to appreciate the message that the video gave. Okay, beautiful.
I knew what to expect.
Okay, amazing. Okay, so now we're going to go to our meditation. I have to go here. Okay. So the relationship becomes purely spiritual, and now to our video meditation.
Welcome to our meditation reflection for Lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of the continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye a loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine the feeling. It's hard to describe it, but if we envision it, we may be able to feel it. What does it feel like? The knowledge that this loved one you may not be able to see them, but they're right there, very, very close by, in the same house, where the family is together, everyone is there, and the only difference is they're upstairs, they're on the second floor. Let's try to envision, let's try to visualize a loved one. Try to remember what it was like when they were on the first floor. And now think about the exact same setting. What does it feel like? What does it feel like knowing that they're on the second floor? They're with us. They're with us. They're in the same house. They're only just a few feet away. Not far, far, far away. Very close by on the second floor. Take a half a minute to visualize and try to connect to this feeling of the loved one on the second floor.
What we want to do now is we want to talk about the moment, the transition that the soul goes through at the point of passing. So generally, we know, and again, everything that's happening in the person without realizing it, the emotions, subconsciously, is related to the soul, which is the true us. And so, the true me. So when a person recognizes that their end of days are coming, often that causes tremendous stress to the individual, anxiety and so on. And therefore, at that time, we try to help that person, so to allow that person to have comfort, to relax. And what do? So there's a couple things that we do. First of all, we spend time talking to that individual, even if that person cannot respond. Often the person might be in a coma, or in a situation where that person cannot respond, but that person's still going through pain. And so what we do is we talk about the good memories. And when I visit someone who's passing and is not completely with us, I'll sing songs that they might remember from when they were younger. And very often you see the person calm down, relax. As the person, you're giving that person, you're relaxing that person. So that's one thing, talking, good memories, making them recognize that they have given something to us, that their life was well lived, and so on. So that's one aspect. Another thing we do is a physical contact, which is very important. We'll hold their hand and give them that physical contact, which is very comforting for that person. The presence of a loved one in itself, just the presence of a loved one, is very comforting. And then we'll create an atmosphere where there will perhaps music or something else that will calm the person down. These things are done before a person passes away because there's a lot of stress at this moment. Recognizing that the stress, one would think that, and often people say this, when someone struggles or suffers physically in this world, when the person passes away, the response a lot of times is, at least that person isn't suffering any longer. And I once heard a rabbi, someone said that to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, how do you know? The person says that this person's not suffering any longer. How do you know? Well, it is true that the physical body, let's say the person was going through a physical ailment that the person was suffering from, and that is true that the person is no longer suffering from that ailment. There's an illness or whatever it is, that person's not suffering from it. But there is pain after the person passes away from the level of the soul. Now, last week we spoke about how the soul, when it comes into this world, it doesn't want to come here. It's forced, right? It's pushed, like the video I showed. It's pushed into this world and forced to come in here into this world, even though it wants to, but it struggles with the idea of a soul having to come into the physical world and have a connection with this physical, with physicality and the material. Text number 2, the Zohar tells us, nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. Interesting. So while we think that the person is now in a good place, it is actually a very difficult phase for the person. Passing is not only difficult for the family members, but is actually a difficult place for the soul, for the person who is passing away as well. Because every transition is difficult. When a child goes to school for the first time, it's very difficult. Most children have a very hard time going to school because there's a transition. And transitions are frightening, and it's difficult to go to a place where we don't know what to expect and so on. Or to go away from a place of comfort, especially for a child. When we make changes in our career also, it could be frightening. You may not be frightened the same way a child is, but there's fear and anxiety. So again, the first thing is there's a transition. And that transition, moving away from the body where it became used to, that is a difficult period for the soul. Number two, the soul didn't want to come into this body only because it didn't relate to the physical body, to the physicality, and to the material world. But to the mission, it related very much. And in fact, the soul, as we will see, becomes very connected to the body, especially when the body helps the soul fulfill its mission and makes an impact in this world. And so when the soul has become used to making an impact and fulfilling mitzvot, that becomes very difficult to be able to have to move away from that, where it knows it can no longer fulfill mitzvot and it can no longer make an impact in the world as it did until now. The third reason why a cause of pain for the soul, I sort of mentioned it, and that is that the soul becomes connected. I can't always see what's on the slides. I know that a powerful bond is broken. I have all the pictures, the images of the students in front of me on the right side of the screen, so I can only see what's on the left. So there is a connection that the soul has with the body, becomes attached. And so when the soul leaves, there's a disconnect of a relationship that it has. So even though there were many things that the body did, for example, eating and drinking and exercising, which the soul doesn't necessarily relate to, there are many things in a good relationship, whether it's a husband and wife or in work, that we don't always appreciate. But because we have a relationship, we're able to appreciate that we can't appreciate it. So the soul comes to a level of appreciating that it can't appreciate the body. And that creates a bond between the body and the soul. Tremendous, tremendous bond. So transitions are hard. The soul can only perform mitzvot in this world. And there is a bond and an attachment that has been developed that is now creates trauma for the soul. So it's not as simple as the soul going up and being in a better place. Of course, yes, we're relieved sometimes from that physical pain that the body had to endure in this world, but there still is pain to some degree that the soul has when the soul departs, as we mentioned. Another point to consider is that the soul doesn't go and leave in one instance. It takes time. There are stages. So the first general stage is 3 days. What's 3 days? So text number 3, this is from the Jerusalem Talmud. For 3 days, the soul hovers over the body, thinking that it can return to it. Remember, it has a relationship. In fact, we do the same thing when we lose a loved one. How many times do we go almost pick up the phone or call a loved one after they pass away because we think and we feel that we can have that relationship and continue that relationship. So just like we have that with our loved ones, the soul, which has become one and united with the body, has that same feeling as well. So for 3 days, the soul is going near the body and thinking that it could reunite with this body with which it had a relationship. When it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. So the body is very precious to the soul. And this departure happens on different levels. So generally 3 days that the soul is this ruach, this higher level of the soul. Remember, nefesh remains in the grave. The ruach, this emotional level of the soul, for 3 days is hovering over the body. Then we have the seven days. Text number 4a. For 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house. And it mourns its body. You see, we think only that we're mourning the loss of our loved ones. But the soul is actually mourning the loss of its relationship with its loved one, which became its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place. That is a quote from the Zohar, from Kabbalah. Text number 4b is also from Kabbalah, and that is this next step, which is 30 days. For 30 days, the soul and body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. So again, the soul is departing, but remember, the soul is like a flame. And parts of a flame could depart first, and then the rest of it can go, right? It doesn't only happen at once. So parts of the soul is going, this energy is sort of departing, and it's departing in stages. And finally, the last stage is for 12 months, the body still exists. This is from the Talmud. For 12 months, the body still exists, and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null, and the soul rises and no longer returns. Now, it's interesting to note that this journey that the soul has, leaving this world, is actually very similar to the journey the soul has when it comes into this world the first time. We think of it as the soul being pushed into a body, and there is the soul in the body, and now we're born, and the soul is here. However, it actually comes in stages, which is the reason why we celebrate a bar and bat mitzvah, because that is the final stage of the soul entering into the body. The first step is conception, which is an important point. The second is birth. It doesn't include going to college, by the way. The third is for a boy, the bris, the girl, the baby naming. Education, which is typically at the age of 6 or 7 years old, when the child is now starts to develop its intellectual capacity. When you start to educate the child, even though today we do it earlier, we try to teach a child from 3 years old, but that is because we want that mitzvot should be something of second nature, should come easily for that child, and the earlier we do it, the more comfortable the child is with the mitzvah. But halachically speaking, from a perspective of Jewish law, the education starts from 6 or 7 years old, because that's the age where intellectually the person or the child is able to start appreciating what they're doing, which is because the soul has now come in and is developing slowly. And now the final stage is the bar and bat mitzvah, where the child has full intellectual capacity when it comes to appreciating the value of a mitzvah and so on. And that's why the child is now responsible to take care of its soul. So when the soul leaves the body, it's the same thing. It goes in stages. This also explains, which I'm sure anybody who has gone through mourning or knows the Jewish steps of mourning can appreciate the different steps of mourning that we have, which are very similar to the steps that we've taken. The first step is text number 5. Mourners observe 3 days of weeping. It actually, in practical halacha, during the first 3 days, we try to speak very little with mourners because it is a very, very difficult time for them. It's a very difficult time also for the soul. 7 days of eulogy. For 30 days, restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, joining a celebration of friends, and traveling on business. And then you have later stages as well. Text number 6, page 53. And this is from Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. If you encounter an acquaintance within 30 days of that person having lost a next of kin, offer words of consolation and avoid the customary pleasantry. If 30 days have elapsed since the relative's passing, greet your acquaintance in the usual manner and offer indirect words of consolation. Avoid mentioning the deceased by name and extend a generic consolation such as, may you be comforted. If your acquaintance is mourning the loss of a parent, you should offer direct messages of comfort for the first 12 months, and only after that scale it back to indirect consolation. So here we see the different levels of consolation, which mirror the different levels of the soul stages of the soul's departure. Because we are not only mourning our loss of our loved ones, we're not only mourning for the person, we are actually mourning with the soul, with our loved ones. It's an interesting perspective because we don't usually think of it that way. Usually we think of that we're mourning the loss of a loved one. And this takes the whole idea of mourning from a Jewish perspective to and practically to a new level, when I could think and realize when we're going through a mourning period that we're not just mourning the loss of a loved one, but we're mourning together with that loved one who is also going through a very difficult period of time. So the 4 stages of mourning correspond to the 4, again, I can't see what's on the other side, to the 4 stages of departure. The degree of mourning on each stage represents the degree of the soul's struggle. And finally, we're not only mourning for the loved one, for the soul, but we're also mourning with the soul. Now we can understand a very interesting text in the Talmud. That if we did not have this introduction and this new way of thinking about the mourning period, we wouldn't be able to appreciate this concept. The Talmud says as follows, text number 7 on page 54. If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased home. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood, as there were no mourners to be comforted. Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased's home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest." Now, if we are mourning our loss, then this doesn't make sense. This only makes sense when we recognize that the soul itself is suffering and struggling with the loss and the separation that it has with the body. And therefore, we now could appreciate why it's important to mourn, even if there is no relative to mourn. Again, because the connection to the soul remains, and we're not just mourning for the soul, we're mourning with the soul. The next step in our class, we're going to go on. I would just, if there's any questions please share in the chat box. I will look at it in a couple moments, but I'm going to go into the next section. I think there's a lot to cover in the next half hour, and I just find this particular class to cover a lot, but it's also fascinating and really puts the whole concept of mourning and the steps that are taken, burial and so on, the journey of the soul, it takes it to a whole new level. What happens after a person passes away? So typically, in the world, not in the Jewish community, the way we deal, what we do is after a person, what is done, I should say, after a person passes away, people want to go to a service. People want to go to be there, to be near. Sometimes they want to, obviously not in the Jewish tradition, but people want to see the body. People want to be around the body and so on, especially if there's a service. But then what happens? After the service, the body is taken and everybody sort of goes home. Okay, in the Jewish community, we know we go to the grave, but there's more to it. One of the, growing up, I should say, I had never attended a service for the passing of anyone. Typically, I had, until I was an adult, if someone passed away in the community, what we did was we participated in the levaya, and this is typically done in religious and Jewish religious communities. Levaya, the word levaya or havaya tamet, means to escort the departed. That is a step that is done that is very, very important, that we walk behind the hearse, or we walk behind the body as the body is being taken out of the chapel. That walking behind the body, walking together with the body, is actually very comforting for the soul, who is struggling and suffering at this point because of that separation, and us walking behind and escorting it, showing our love to the person that we love, is something that is very, very powerful. And the deceased senses our presence, and we learn that they very much appreciate it. So that's a very, very important thing. Is not just going to the service, but actually doing something to show the loved one, or to show the deceased person, that we care and we feel for their soul and for the body and for the struggles that they are going through. Text number 8a, again a quote from the Talmud. One, this is very powerful. One who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. So typically, what happens is, a person who is present at the time of the passing would tear their garment, which often is done at the funeral, because the person wasn't there at the time of the passing. If a person is there at the time of the passing, the person would rend their garments at the time of the passing. Now, originally, it was anybody who was there at the time of passing would rend their garments. Later, that changed for different technical reasons, and I don't want to go into them now, but the idea is that we tear the garments because we feel this departure of the soul from the body is something which is so difficult and is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. What does that mean? So I'll explain it in a moment. But let's read text number 8b. Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto a Torah scroll's parchment, as an example of the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. So basically, 1 second. A body, a human body, is compared to the physical Torah scroll. The physical Torah scroll begins as an animal. It's the hide of a kosher animal. Then what happens? The soul is infused in the body, just as after a person the scribe inks the words, the names of God, onto the Torah scroll. Now what happens is the Torah scroll that before was just a piece of animal now becomes something sacred, becomes something holy. The body also becomes something holy. And not only is there holiness in the Torah, because, meaning the reason why we kiss a Torah is because we recognize that the holiness is not something that's just within the spiritual part of the Torah, but we recognize that the physical Torah itself actually becomes something that is holy. And that is the reason why we tear our garments, because we recognize the pain of not only of the spiritual energy, but also of the physical body. That teaches us that the physical body becomes holy. Text number 9. All who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. What we recognize is that even after, so what happens? When you have a Torah scroll, often, after many years, a Torah scroll can become pasul, which means it becomes invalid. If it cannot be repaired, let's say a word gets scratched out and it is not able to be repaired, but so even though it after the body the Torah scroll becomes invalid, after the Torah scroll becomes invalid, the Torah scroll does not lose its holiness. The Torah scroll maintains its holiness. And if a Torah scroll cannot be repaired, the Torah scroll also has to be buried in a very, very special way. So the Torah scroll, we recognize that the Torah scroll is not only in the spiritual energy that the Torah scroll has, but in the physical Torah scroll itself. So too we recognize that the physical body, after the soul comes into this physical body, the physical body attains holiness. And because we recognize that the physical body is holy, we have to treat that physical body in a very special way. And how is that done? So in the Jewish community, we have something called a Chevra Kadisha. And the Chevra Kadisha it's called the Holy Group, Chevra Kadisha. And they have the job of tending to the physical body after a loved one departs. And they literally treat it like a live body, meaning they give it complete dignity, which is not done in other I shouldn't say religions, in the world in general. After a person passes away, they do a lot of very nice things to the body until the family is left. And when it's time to put the body into the grave or do whatever they do to the body, they're no longer respecting and honoring the body. But in Judaism, because we recognize the holiness that the soul imparts to the body itself, we are very, very careful. And so, number one, they treat it like it's still alive. Very, very, very gentle. They try not to have any conversations in front of the body, even though one would think that, this is just a body, it's just a shell. And what is it here anyway? What is it? But we recognize that there's holiness to it, and so we don't have conversations. We make sure that it's covered, even as they're washing the body. They cover the body, and only uncover the parts that they're actually washing. And furthermore, men wash and tend to the bodies of men, and women tend to the bodies of women. Also, again, to give dignity and respect to the physical body. Also, we never face the body down. It wouldn't be respectful. So the body remains the entire time after death, always remains facing upwards. So we were very, very careful. Also, another thing that we're very careful about recognizing the holiness of the body is that we would have what's called a shomer, is someone who will spend time with the body, that the body should not be alone after the passing. And that person who stays with the body would usually recite words of Tehillim in memory of the deceased. And that is, we could see in text number 10. We are required to maintain constant watch over a corpse even during the daytime, and even if there is no cause to suspect that something can happen to the body. Those who maintain watch are actively performing a mitzvah to the extent that they are meanwhile absolved from many other mitzvot, such as reading the Shema and reciting the prayers at the appropriate times. That's how important it is. We maintain a watch over the dead out of respect, for if we were to leave the body alone, it would appear as if we have abandoned the body like a utensil that we no longer require. And we recognize, again, let's go through a little review. The body is handled with respect and dignity. It's cleaned and dressed in shrouds, and that is done in a very special way, in a respectful way. No casual conversations. The body has to be kept covered. Never placed face down, and always guarded. This is also a reason, because we recognize how holy the body is, that's also a reason why we're very careful that every single part of the body is actually buried. Very, very important. There is an organization in Israel that's called Zaka, and after terrorist attacks or in hospitals, they go to different places where people have died in unusual ways, and they will collect the body parts to make sure that every single body part, again recognizing that every single part of the body is holy, to give that proper burial. Very, very important. And this is the as it says in text 11, when we talk about a Torah, you know, every single letter of the Torah is important. Every part of the Torah scroll is holy, and therefore the same thing is with the body. There is no differentiation between a complete Torah scroll and a single letter of a Torah that has become detached from a Torah scroll. Similarly, it is forbidden to handle with disrespect even a single bone that has become detached from a sacred body that was created in God's image. It's something that we haven't really discussed here, the concept of being created in God's image, that the body itself is created in God's image. The soul and the body together is created in God's image. And so the body itself has tremendous, tremendous holiness, and that is something that we are very, very careful with. So just reading one of a message that came through. A soul enters the body and develops over time. When that soul leaves the body at death, it no longer develops. Okay, so there's two things. There's the soul developing and gaining through its actions, which it benefits from afterwards. So that's one idea. And the other idea is it's coming into this world, which means its journey into this world is in stages. The body is developing based on those stages. That's not so much the soul developing, it's the soul coming into the body more and more. But yes, the soul also leaves the body in stages, and after it leaves the body, it does not develop and cannot gain. There's no place in heaven that the soul could do actions that could make it go on a higher level. In fact, that's one of the reasons, and we'll talk about it in later lessons, one of the reasons why we do mitzvot in memory of our loved ones, and that is because they can no longer do things to develop their soul and to reach a higher level. We would do that for them on their behalf. But we will come to that in a different level, in a different future class. But the idea here is not so much the development, but rather the stages in which it journeys into the body and leaves the body also in different stages. I hope that answered your question. Okay. Now we're going to go on to burial. Being that we recognize there's something else that we also have to recognize besides the body becoming holy. There's also something else that's very important. And that is to recognize that the body was given to us as a loan. It actually is related to something, loans in this week's Torah portion. That just like whenever God gives us a mitzvah, God does that mitzvah too. And in this week's Torah portion, one of the many mitzvot that we learn is about lending someone who needs financial assistance to lend them money. And so God also lends us, because every mitzvah that God gives us, he does himself. That's why they're called God's commandments, God's laws, because God himself does them. And so the mitzvahs are done by God as well. So how does God loan? And God loans us our physical body to allow us to accomplish what we need to accomplish in this world. So we want to talk about burial. This woman comes to the rabbi and she says to the rabbi, I want to show you my will. I want to make sure that everything is okay, is kosher. Can you go through it? The rabbi starts reading and he sees that she writes that she does not want to be buried in a Jewish grave, in a Jewish graveyard. So the rabbi says, I don't understand. Why wouldn't you want to be buried in a Jewish cemetery? So the woman says, what I want to be buried is I want to be buried in Bloomingdale's. The rabbi says, why Bloomingdale's? She says, because there I know that my daughter will come to visit me. It's an old joke. Okay. But the point is here, simply when a person's buried, yes, a person's buried, it allows the loved ones to come and to be there. But there's much, much more to burial, as we will see today, a benefit for the family, a benefit for the soul. Text number 12, page 61, this is from Deuteronomy. You shall bury him on the same day as his death. In fact, because the soul is going through this struggle of disconnect between the soul and the body, it is Jewish custom to try to bury an individual as close as possible to the time of death. Because once the body is buried, the soul is able to recognize what's going on, is able to calm down a little bit. So we try to do that right away. People, text number 13, people proceed to their eternal abodes, and the mourners go about the streets. The dust returns to the earth as it was, while the spirit returns to God, who bestowed it. The idea is, again, that a body it comes from the earth, it's given to us as a deposit, And then later, the body, because it comes from the earth, it has to return to the earth from where it came. As it says in text number 14, which I will not read, but the idea is, again, that, and we see this throughout the Torah, the idea of burial. We see Abraham goes to great lengths to buy a suitable grave for his wife Sarah, and there's much discussion in the Torah about this, the acquisition of this grave. We read about Isaac and Ishmael burying Abraham. We read about Jacob burying Rachel. We read about Jacob saying that he doesn't want to be buried in the land of Egypt and asking to be taken out. We read about Joseph, who asks to be taken out when the Jewish people eventually leave, which was 140 years later. And we know one of the most powerful, as we're taught, that we have to go in the ways of God, and that's what it says in the Torah. And it says, just as God takes care of the poor, so too we have to take care of the poor. That's going in God's ways. Just as God visits the sick, so too we have to visit the sick. And we bring different verses in the Torah to teach us each of these attributes of God. So we also find that God himself in the Torah buries Moses. And so the idea of burial is something that is considered a very important thing in Judaism, Kever Yisrael, which is called a Jewish burial. And in Israel, even today, the IDF will go to great difficulties and great risks to be able to bring back the body of a fallen soldier to give them, to grant them a Jewish burial. So that's something that's very, very important. Why is it so important? Okay, so yes, it's a deposit that we got from God and we have to give it back, but there's more to it. And that is that when we bury our loved ones, we are actually affirming that we believe. What do we believe in? So these are very important points. Number one, we believe that our bodies do not belong to us, which is one of the reasons why in Judaism there's an old myth which we had a JLI course a number of years back, which was facts and myths in Judaism. And in that class, one of the myths that we discussed was the myth of if a person, that the older generation used to tell their children that you can't, in Judaism, you cannot give yourself a tattoo, and if you do, you will not be able to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That is a myth. It was told to the children by their parents because the parents wanted to show how terrible it is to do something to one's body. The real reason why a person in Judaism, we do not do anything to our body that is unnecessary, which means we also had a course about medical ethics, and there are certain things that you could do to one's body if a person is going to feel better, meaning if the person is going to be given greater life and energy because the person will feel better. But it's just to make a change to your body, to cause pain, to make a change to your body is not something that we do lightly, and if there's something has to be done, it's something that we have to ask and discuss with a rabbi in general, because again, we recognize that our bodies do not belong to us. Our bodies are ours to take care of. We have to exercise, we have to eat, we have to drink, we have to sleep, all of those things to take care of the body, because we recognize the holiness of our body, and therefore we have to take care of our body. So when we bury a body, rather than the other option, which would be cremation, we are affirming that we believe and recognize that this body belongs to God, and therefore once the soul has departed from the body, it no longer belongs to us, and we can't do anything to it, and therefore we have to do what God says, because that's the one who gave it to us, and so we give it back to the one who gave it to us. We return the loan at the end of a person's life. Again, because our bodies do not belong to us, and therefore it is not for us to decide how to inter the body. Let me see what it says here. And a very important thing is that we recognize by burying the body, we are affirming our belief in the resurrection of the dead that will happen when Mashiach comes. When we take the body and we put it back into the ground, is because we believe that one day that body will be resurrected. And this is one of the great beliefs as Jewish people that we have, one of the 13 beliefs in resurrection. And so not only are we affirming our belief that God gave us the body, but we are also affirming our belief in the resurrection of the dead. Now, here comes a very challenging question. And that is, what happens if a person gave instructions before they pass away and they say they do not want to be buried, they want the alternative? How, recognizing that in Judaism, the body belongs to God. On the other hand, we know that there is a mitzvah to fulfill, as it says in text 15a, it is a mitzvah to implement the expressed final wishes of the deceased. If it's a mitzvah to listen to the final wishes of the deceased, it would seem proper to follow their wishes in what they want and how they want to be buried. Right? Because you have to follow their wishes. And if a person asks to be cremated and you instead bury them, that goes against their wishes. So the Maimonides, in his laws of mourning rites, which is text 15b, if a person requested not to be buried, we disregard the request. This is because burial is a mitzvah, as it is stated, you shall surely bury him. So here's a very interesting perspective. Now look, if a person, and we all know people, I don't know everybody in this group, if anybody's experienced cremation before, but we all know people who have opted for cremation, or family members who have done that. And we're not judging anyone. And simply in Judaism, we don't judge people unless they were completely informed. But now we are discussing what would happen if someone came to the rabbi and said to the rabbi, Rabbi, I have a problem. I know you tell me that the Torah says that we have to bury our loved ones. However, my loved one gave a specific instruction before they passed away not to be buried. How do we deal with that? Now, it's very nice for me to take out Maimonides and say, well, Maimonides says this is the only thing that we don't listen to a person. But it's not a very comfortable thing to say to someone, because often this we feel the way a person is going to, what's going to happen to a person's body after they pass away really determines how respectful we are of that person's wishes, perhaps their final wish, right? And therefore this creates, from an emotional perspective, a very great challenge. So how do we deal with this challenge? So there are 2 points that I want to make. One is on a very simple level. If someone you love comes along and tells you, I want you to break my window. Person says, break my window? I'll break your window. Why not? It's your window, right? What happens if a person comes along and says, I would like you to break that window? thinking that that window is theirs. But after the person told it to you, you found out that that window, they thought it was theirs, but it wasn't really theirs. That window was actually someone else's. Just because that person, you love that person, and that person asked you a favor, doesn't give you the right or wouldn't motivate you now to break this window once you know that this window belongs to someone else. Therefore, on a very simple level, we don't consider this wish of an individual to be buried in a different way, or not to be buried in the ground, or not to be buried, I should say, in the Jewish way, simply because we now realize that the body is not theirs for them to make a decision about. They perhaps thought that the body was theirs, but we now realize that the body was not theirs. The body belonged to God. It was theirs to take care of. Now that the body, the soul has departed, we now recognize that the body did not belong to that person, and the body has to be given back to God who gave it. And that is on a simple level why we wouldn't consider that person's final wish, even though it seems unfair. On a deeper level, if what we said last week, that a person is not their physical body, and as we said at the very beginning of today's lesson, we explained that what happens is a soul is the true part of a person, and that the body sort of covers up and doesn't allow the soul to express itself fully. So now I realize that we are not truly in touch with our soul and our true desires when we're living in this physical world. And therefore we can argue that even though a person may have said that they want to be buried in a non-Jewish way, that was only because they weren't in touch with their true deep desire. Again, they didn't recognize that their body belonged to God, and they didn't recognize their true desire, which was to be buried. Now, once the person, the soul, departs from the body, and now the soul is not limited to the limitations and the feelings of the body, and it recognizes its true feelings and desires, the moment after that person passes away. If I ask you, what is that person's desire now? Not what they asked you earlier, but what is their desire now after they've passed away? Yes, they wrote in their will that they want to be buried a different way. But what is their desire now on a soul level? The answer is that they want to be buried in the Jewish way, because that's what the soul wants. And therefore, we can argue that their true desire and their desire now is actually different than their desire before. And this is the way we could rationalize this idea of not following again, it's not that we're punishing them and we're not following their desire because it's not Jewish, but we recognize that A, they didn't have the ability to make that decision, and B, that decision was not really their true desire. Their true desire was to do something, was to do what their soul wanted, and that is what they want right now. I want to finish off with one last part, which is grave visitation. I know I'm a few minutes over. I'm going to finish off the idea of grave visitation. What happens then? So we know that the soul, we spoke about how the soul, the body is holy. We spoke about how the soul departs and the journey is in different steps. And now we're going to talk about, for a couple minutes, the grave visitation. So, visiting the grave. Number one, we visit the grave because of respect for the departed. Yes, something we are all aware of. We also want the soul to recognize, the person, our loved one, to recognize that their memory has not been forgotten. But more importantly, there is a relationship that continues between us and our loved ones even after they pass away. As we spoke about earlier and in the meditation, that the soul does not leave us, but rather leaves the confines of the body, and now it's on the second floor, so to speak, and we're able to continue to have this relationship. So going to the burial place of our loved ones reinforces our continuous connection with our loved one. I want to just acknowledge Teddy and Sam, who first yard site of Teddy's mom and Sam's wife was this past Sunday, and I was supposed to go with them to the cemetery on Sunday, but due to the snow, I stayed home. But they went and they spent their moment of connection. I want to just wish you at this time the blessings of long life and health, as is customary at a time of a yard site, and recognize that the soul of your of Teddy, of your mom, of Sam, of your wife, of Rima, of blessed memory, Rachel, continues in a greater way than ever before. And when one goes to the burial place, one reinforces that connection that we have. Also, when we're at a burial place, we are recognizing our connection. We are asking our loved ones, by having a connection, for them to pray on our behalf. And we are also communicating from soul to soul, a level of our soul that is communicating, and we recognize that the souls are actually sensitive and pleased when their loved ones come to visit. So we're not only doing it for ourselves. It's very important to know that we're not only doing it for ourselves, that we should remember our loved ones. And we should we feel better when we honor our loved ones. But we are actually bringing tremendous pleasure and nachas to our loved ones when we go to visit them. So sometimes if we were able to go on just for a very quick visit, typically people go twice a year, once on the yard site and once before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So we recognize that there is a continuous connection. The soul, the ruach, departs. The nefesh, which is the functional part of the soul, actually over the time also departs, but there's always one part of the nefesh, the lowest part of the nefesh, the functional soul, that forever stays in the grave. So there is a true connection that we can have with our loved ones when we're by a grave, and often we'll see people who actually talk or communicate, whether or not the other person is listening to the exact words or whatever it is. Okay, I don't know, because I haven't been on the other side of the, thank God, and I'm not planning to get there anytime soon. But but what I do know is that when we stand there, they have nachas, and there is a true connection, and they could hear us. And actually, I should mention that when we did the meditation before, I said I started to think about my maternal grandmother. And a year and a half ago, I went to England, and there were two times that my parents would take, my mother I should say would take my siblings to her parents' grave. One was before their bar mitzvah, and one was before their wedding. For some reason, I never went. Well, my grandmother only passed away 17 years ago. My grandfather passed away many years before. But that was the first time I had heard so much about my grandfather. I don't know why. I'd never been. But I went for the first time, and it gave me that connection that, I always felt like there was a missing piece of the puzzle. I'd heard so much about my grandfather, who passed away a number of years before I was born. But that allowed me to feel that connection. But it wasn't just, again, now we realize it's not just to feel that connection. There is really a true connection that happens when we go to the grave of a loved one, or we go to the grave of a tzaddik. I want to finish off with one last text a letter, a correspondence that the Rebbe wrote to Mrs. Chana Sharfstein in 1958. At the time, she was quite young, and in a 5-year period, she had lost her father, her mother, and mother-in-law. Again, they were not elderly. She was young, and the Rebbe responded to her as follows. Text number 18, and I want to finish this class with this text. Blessing and greeting. I received your undated letters, in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father, peace unto them. So the first thing the Rebbe points out that they don't bring here is that we're not able to understand God's ways. And we are limited creations. And the first thing that we have to establish as human beings, as Jews and as human beings, is that we have limited capacity of understanding. But then the Rebbe goes on into the emotional part. And the Rebbe says as follows: another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, the principle has even been discovered in this physical world, where science now holds as an absolute truth that nothing in the physical world can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs of the body, the spiritual soul would also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, as we learned today, inasmuch as it is no longer handicapped by the restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one, due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributes of the soul and not of the body. Therefore, also, every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and the desire to benefit that person is not directed towards pleasing his physical body, his bones and tissue, for it is the spiritual pleasure that one is concerned with. So when we're giving pleasure to someone, we're not thinking about their physical body, we're thinking about their emotional pleasure, the spiritual pleasure. In the view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body is disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul, which is noted above, not only survives, but does so on a higher level, and all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here. Now, when we say the pleasure, things that will continue to give pleasure, if the person was a sports fan, showing them a baseball or basketball or telling them about the sports is not necessarily, it's not going to give them pleasure, because now they are all spiritual, and those are physical, material things. So they're good deeds. When we go to them, when we want to connect to them, when we want to talk about their good deeds, the things that they accomplished, the joy that they gave other people, the mitzvahs that they did, the charity, and so on, the kindness that they lived with, and the impact that they made on other people, those are the things that we continue to give them nachas and joy with. And that is a very different way of looking at the physical body and the journey of the soul.